It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting by emailing me directly at oppermaninvestigations at gmail.com. We're updating the website, so I'm going to be changing the domain name. So that's the best way to reach me right now. I'm really excited about today's show. We have Alec Karakatsanis, and he's works for, you can find him on Twitter at Equality Alec. And the organization he runs is called civilrightscores.org. You could find him there. He's got this great book, which I can't wait to talk to him about, called Unusual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System. Mr. Karakatsanis, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much, man. And thank you for being patient with me, too, because I know we had a little problem last week when I got the wrong day, so I was talking to myself. Tell us about yourself. Before we get into your organization, you're the civilrightscore.org. Who is Alec Karakatsanis?
Well, I graduated from law school in 2008 and started my career as a public defender in Alabama. And my role there was representing people who were accused of federal crimes who were too poor to afford an attorney. Most of my clients were accused of things like possessing a substance that's on a list of substances the government says you're not able to possess, or possessing a firearm without appropriate documentation and permission, or crossing the imaginary political boundary that leads, separates two countries, having been born on the wrong side of that boundary. So all of these are offenses that make up the vast bulk of the crimes that the federal government charges very poor people with. And then I went to the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., where my job was to investigate and uncover systemic injustices and unconstitutional behavior in the local courts here in Washington, D.C. And during that job, I challenged things like the rampant shackling and full mental restraint of all children who appear in court. So I would represent children who were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, children who'd been abused and neglected, children who had intellectual and physical disabilities, who were being fully restrained in metal chains in contravention of the Constitution and of various international treaties on how children are supposed to be treated in court. I also did a lot of work around prosecutor and police brutality and misconduct cases where police would frequently sexually and physically assault people and beat them up, and prosecutors would cover it up in their cases. I also did a lot of work around something called civil forfeiture, which is a way in which the police take people's property even though they're not accused of a crime, and keep it or sell it. And police take more property from people in civil forfeiture every year than all burglary combined in the United States. Huge problem. And then in 2014, I decided to start my own civil rights organization and left my job. And I began going around the country challenging systemic injustices in our criminal legal system. You know, we jail people in this country about 5 times the rate of our own historical average up until about 1980. And we jail people about 5 to 10 times as much as other comparable countries, including, we jail black people in this country at 6 times the rate of South Africa at the height of apartheid. And so what we do around the country is we file civil rights cases on systemic injustices. So, for example, the issue for which we're probably most well known is suing cities and counties and sheriffs and prosecutors and judges all over the country for jailing people before they're convicted of anything because they can't pay cash bail. And there are about 500,000 people right now, as you and I are talking, in this country who are in jail cells, separated from their children and their families, just because they can't pay cash. And those are the kinds of issues that we work on. Now we're up to a team of about almost 30 people, and we do this work all over the country.
Now, when you take those if you're taking civil rights cases regarding people with cash bail, and I know exactly what you're talking about, especially you'll have in Nevada. I used to be from Nevada. You'll have a domestic violence case, and the bail is $4,000. So it'll happen on a Saturday night. You don't see the judge till Monday morning. You got to go to work that day, so you plead guilty. You don't have the $4,000. You got to plead guilty, and now it happens again 7 years later, and now you're facing big time. But if you're taking those kind of civil rights cases, how do you fund that? There isn't a big payoff in that kind of case, is there?
We're a nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations of people all over the country to support our work. Sometimes when we win cases, our clients and us get some fees to compensate for our time and our work from the government, but mostly we rely on philanthropic contributions from people. And if anyone wants to donate, they can donate on our website at civilrightscorps.org, and CORE is spelled CORPS.
Okay, so then you're not shooting for those big cases, those big police brutality cases, wrongful death cases by cops. You're not shooting for those to fund your organization?
No, we don't fund our organization by trying to fund it through our cases, because one thing that happens when you start to do that is you start to make decisions based on what makes money and not what actually changes these systems.
Okay, so then excellent. So then this is incredible. Okay, I'm really surprised to hear this, to tell you the truth, because when you look at these big, when you see these big civil rights lawyers out there, they're all making huge. These are big money cases, man. So now, what kind of people do you want to attract then?
The people that work with us all over the country, both the people who work at our organization and all of our amazing local partners across the country, are people who believe very deeply that the way that our current legal system functions is incredibly unfair, but also ineffective. If jailing and prisons and more police and more state surveillance and violence made us safe, we'd be the safest country in the history of the world. But we're not the safest country in the history of the world, because those are actually not the interventions. It's not judges and prosecutors and cops and probation and parole officers and, private prisons. Those are not the kinds of investments that actually reduce harm and violence. The kinds of things that actually reduce harm and violence are investments in things like school, early childhood education and teachers, medical and mental health care, access to the kinds of treatment that people need, safe places to live, right? After school programs, theater, art, music, poetry. These are actually the kinds of things that affect levels of violence in society, and not police, prosecutors, prisons, jails, incarceration. So the folks that work with us are people that believe very deeply that the central problems in our world are more the result of inequality than they are of lack of punishment. And so we are trying to dismantle these systems of punishment that this country has set up and that have metastasized over the last 40 years, and instead replace them with meaningful investments in real safety.
Yeah, it seems like the solution for all American problems, either foreign or domestic, is to shoot at it. You know what I mean? It's like the most. If we could only solve the COVID crisis by shooting at it, I think we'd fund it to the hilt. Now, what do you see? You're right. This system's broken. The system is just incredibly broken, and it's not even solving the problems that we want it to solve. Now, from my dealing with this as a criminal defense investigator for years, one of the main issues I see in the criminal court is mental illness, poverty, and drug addiction. How does your organization hope to address those issues?
Well, one of the big things is that we have to stop as a society treating mental illness, drug addiction, poverty, homelessness as issues of punishment and police. And until we stop doing that, our society is gonna be investing tens of billions of dollars in exactly the wrong approach to solving those problems. And so one of the first things we do is we say, you need to stop punishing people for being addicted. You need to stop punishing people for being mentally ill. You stop punishing people for not having anywhere to live. And instead, you need to think about, what are the root causes of those problems and invest in that instead. And until we start doing that, the people who own things in our society, people that benefit from how unequal and unjust our legal system is, and make no mistake, there are a lot of people who benefit. It's big business.
Yeah.
That is why our laws are so ineffective. Until we stop that incredible profiteering off of all of these harms, none of these problems are ever going to be solved.
Yeah, that's exactly what's going to be my next question, because we are throwing a lot of money in criminal justice, I guess you'd call it, right, or policing or law enforcement. But that money, especially in the court system, is getting sucked up by these DUI classes and domestic violence classes, and all these guys. They're all custody evaluators, psychiatric evaluators, who are making a ton of money. Because they're friends with guys in the system. It's all a big club. How do we get around that?
Well, I think the number one, there's always going to be corruption.
Yeah.
And bureaucracies are always going to be inefficient and corrupt. I think the number one thing is we have to be making these bureaucracies smaller. I mean, the main solution that I've seen in my work time and time again is if you build these big systems, if you create these opportunities to profit, there's going to be corruption around it. And people are going to take advantage of it. Yeah. And so we need to be adopting, and this is one of the things that I explain in great detail with lots of examples in my book, but we need to be adopting policies that shrink the size of this bureaucracy, because if you shrink its size, you automatically reduce the opportunities for people to profit from it. So just to give you some more examples, like, there's if you build new jails, you're creating enormous incentives to fill them with people.
All right.
You're creating enormous incentives for these companies to then build new jails in other places. Another example is, when Michael Brown was killed, a lot of police organizations and private corporations pushed body cameras as a solution. They said, well, wait a second, if we just put body cameras on cops, that'll be a solution to police brutality. But that was a kind of a fraudulent and profiteering kind of suggestion, because police have wanted body cameras for a long, long time, but they didn't have the billions of dollars that it would take to outfit every cop in the country with a surveillance camera. Keep in mind, with body cameras, police control them. They decide when to turn them on, when to turn them off. They look outward at us and not inward at what the police are doing, right? And they're very easily manipulable, and very, very rarely, like look at the George Floyd or Eric Garner cases, it was a bystander's video, not the body camera, that ended up being the actual evidence against the police. So, but police couldn't get the money, the billions of dollars to fund them. So what did they do? They had a nationwide movement to convince liberal people that the solution to police brutality, so they used their own brutality and violence, was to outfit all the cops with surveillance cameras. And their real goal all along was to link those surveillance cameras to facial and video recognition software databases that they've been building with companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Palantir. It's a classic example of a solution involving more resources and more money and more profiteering in the bureaucracy, rather than a solution that would have said something like, well, why in the world are police attacking and arresting Eric Garner for, selling counterfeit cigarettes? Why are police stopping Philando Castile 48 times before they murder him, right? Why are police doing all of these things that most people don't realize, that 96% of all police time in this country is for things that even the police call nonviolent? Mm-hmm. If people understood that, they would be far less supportive of having armed government agents do most of what police actually do, which is respond to mental health incidents, deal with people who are unhoused, deal with mental illness, deal with traffic infractions and whatnot. And so the first step in any reform to stemming a lot of this corruption, just make the bureaucracy smaller.
I'm glad you brought that back around, because recently I did a show. In fact, I played a repeat of a show I did about these bizarre, suspicious deaths inside this prison system. I forget where it was. I want to say Cleveland, Ohio, something like that. But these bizarre, suspicious deaths were going on there, and I was talking to some experts on the topic, and even there would be a death inside the prison, and they were backdating the release date on the prisoner. Okay, so they were all involved in it. Medical examiners, everyone was involved in this. And one of the comments on YouTube was, well, who cares, Ed? They're criminals. You know, how do we change people's thinking about that? The same thing about undocumented aliens who come to this country seeking asylum. Ed, what don't you understand? They're illegal. What don't you understand about the word illegal? Like, once you're described as illegal or a criminal or a quote unquote bad guy, you have no worth. You have in the mind of the average American person. How do we get into that?
I think a really important point to make is that all people do things that are wrong or that are crimes very frequently. So most people in this country commit a serious crime every single day. And there's a lot of literature about all the crimes that we're all committing at all times. But let me just say something very clearly. Police, prosecutors, and prisons and judges, they only enforce some laws against some people some of the time. For example, wage theft is a rampant crime. It costs about $50 billion a year, about 5 times all other property crimes combined. So about 10 times the amount of money taken from burglary, right? Wage thieves are business owners, corporations, etc. This is almost completely ignored. So if that crime were actually enforced, a large percentage of American businesses would be guilty of that crime. But it's not enforced, right? Another example, drug laws, right? So all over the country, drug laws are routinely and almost completely ignored in wealthy boarding schools, in university campuses, on Wall Street, for example. Each of the last, several presidents has admitted to committing federal drug felonies. They were never prosecuted, right? Instead, drug laws are ruthlessly and brutally enforced against poor people and people of color. And once you're in the system with a conviction, you lose your housing, you lose you're not unable to live in public housing. You can, if you're not in public housing and in private housing, you can lose your house anyway because of the missed rent payments from being in jail. It's very hard to get a job. And so it sets people off on these cycles. And so what we actually know is that jailing people and prosecuting them with low-level crimes, like drug possession, for example, actually makes them more likely to commit crime in the future because you've now destabilized their life. You've exposed them to a tremendously traumatic experience in jail where they're likely to be physically and sexually abused by guards, deprived of fresh air and sunlight, exposed to all kinds of other horrors and traumas. So I guess what I'm saying is, well, I guess let me give you another example as well. Take environmental crimes. There are over 100,000 Clean Water Act violations that are crimes every single year. Almost none of them are prosecuted. There are hundreds of thousands of air pollution violations every single year. None of them are prosecuted. Illegal and fraudulent home foreclosure. The biggest crime of all, tax evasion, costs about $1 trillion a year. So 100 times all other minor property crimes combined. So if you steal money from 7-Eleven, you're going to be prosecuted. But if you evade taxes, you're not going to be prosecuted. Almost no one is prosecuted for that. In last fiscal year, the government prosecuted only 23 people federally for environmental crimes, but they prosecuted 23,000 people for drug crimes and more than 23,000 people for immigration offenses. So I guess the point is that, whether you've been convicted of a crime or not is not a very good indication of whether you've caused harm or whether you're a good person or a bad person. Everyone is so much more than the one criminal act that they were convicted of, right? And so I think it's just really important to ask yourself the following question. How do we get to a society where those things happen less, where there is less violence, less crime, less harm? And the answer is not to punish people, because the countries that punish people far less, and the United States, when it punished people far less, were far safer places with much less violence. It's the root causes that we should focus on. And so I can understand, how, and I've definitely heard myself, people saying, well, how can you defend those people? And it doesn't matter what happens to them. They deserve what they're getting. What those people are missing is that attitude is actively creating more crime.
It's so true. So, and if, like I was saying before about the guy who had the domestic violence charge and couldn't pay the $4,000, so he missed work Monday morning. Well, Tuesday morning when he goes back to work and they say, "Hey, what happened?" He doesn't say, "Oh, I got arrested." Like your buddy at work got arrested, but he's not telling you, so you don't know. He's not a bad guy. He's the guy you work with. You know what I mean? Just because you got a DUI or some kind of problem like that, he's not a bad guy. He's a guy you work with. And the same thing with undocumented aliens. These are the people you're buying your Slurpee from at 7-Eleven. These are the people, you see these people every day. These are people you live next door. They're not bad people. They're not evil.
Well, let me just say, over 100 million Americans have a close relative with a criminal conviction. So these are all of our relatives. These are all of us. When you talk about like criminals, not only are all of us committing crimes every day that are not being prosecuted, but many of our loved ones are actually convicted of these offenses.
I think it's like 1 out of 5, right? It's insane in this country. Also, too, you were talking before about tax evasion and who the IRS chooses to prosecute. I had David K. Johnson on this show, who's an expert in that area, and he tells me the only thing they're investigating right now are divorced parents and which one is abusing the what's that thing called, the dependent clause, that they're overlapping, naming their kids as dependents. That they're both naming it at the same time. That's the only thing they're going after right now. It's just insane. But in the same light, how we're talking about public perception, now just recently you testified before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors about this very topic, about how law enforcement is using the media to manipulate our thinking.
One of the scariest things about my research into this area is how little people know about how much time, effort, and money police spend on manipulating what we see in the media. I first became interested in this when looking at how consistent and how misleading and how full of misinformation many media articles were about things that I knew a great deal about, things like bail reform, things like police, things like the coverage of trials, etc. And then the more I started looking into it, the more troubling it got. I realized that, by reading some local investigations, for example, that the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles had a total in terms of the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, a total of 67 full-time employees working on manipulating public information. That is an incredible expenditure of resources, way more than large corporations spend on PR. And those are just the cops who spend their full-time job on public information. There's a whole wide range of other, ways in which the police, through their social media accounts, through their videographers. So, for example, like many police departments now have full-time videographers who make glorifying videos of cops. They have information officers that manipulate the statistics that go to the media. Many of them have actually been caught fraudulently reporting various crime rates over the years. And so in city after city, when I looked into it, for example, it came out a few weeks ago that the city of San Francisco had a 9-person PR unit. The head of it was making $300,000 a year almost. And they had another unit whose job was to respond immediately to the scene of the crime if the police had murdered someone, in order to try to manipulate the person's family and to control the story right away. And 2 officers go out and try to intervene with any journalists that report to the scene. This is just a small window into a huge industry. And there's obviously also private strategic communications and public relations firms that specialize in helping police do damage control after they kill people. Every single police department in the country sees itself as part of a propaganda effort. And their goal is really threefold. Their first goal is to narrow our conception of what safety means. They want us focused on what the FBI and police departments call index crimes, the 8 crimes, things like murder, rape, aggravated assault, larceny, etc. The crimes that you see in the news. They do not want us focused on some of the crimes I talked about earlier: tax evasion, wage theft from low-income workers, environmental crimes, child molestation, all the crimes that police hardly ever investigate at all, and they don't devote their resources to. Even take something like sexual assault, which is an index crime, is largely ignored by police. Most sexual assaults are never even reported to cops. cops are sitting on hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits because they prefer to use their resources to go seeking drug busts. Drug busts are way more profitable to cops because they can seize property in them, and they can make easy arrests, and they can get more money in overtime for each arrest. So they want us focused on a very narrow range of harms. They don't want us thinking about safety in a more broad, holistic notion. The way that we would all think about it, when you ask someone, like, what is your safe place? Imagine being in a safe place. What are you thinking about? Nobody's thinking about cops. They're thinking about, like, a place where they have a place to live, a place where their children and them have access to clean water and food and places to exercise and parks, etc. Like, that's the image that most people have of safety. And instead, the cops are interested in narrowing our conception to only the things that cops deal with. And as I said earlier, those things are largely crimes committed by the poor. That's what cops focus on. 90% of people arrested by police around this country are living in poverty.
Yeah, it's so true. Even getting pulled over, you're much more likely to get pulled over if you're driving an old car than a brand new car.
Oh, absolutely. At every stage, all the statistics show that police are basically only enforcing criminal laws against the poor. But the second thing that police do, and I think this is really insidious, is having narrowed our conception of safety to just a few index crimes, they constantly want us thinking that crime is rising, right? So we're actually living at a time when police-reported index crimes are near historic 40-year lows. And instead, all over the country, though, there's story after story in the media about how crime is rising. There's a crime wave. And I've documented a lot on Twitter how this is actually completely contrary to the evidence. But one of the things that police want to do is they know that when you fearmonger and people are afraid, they're more likely to support repressive policies that are very profitable to police and to many other people in the punishment bureaucracy. And then the third thing that police propaganda units want to do, and this is, I think, the most important and most consequential thing that they do, is they want us to think that the solution to this panic over crime is always more police prosecutors in cages. They want us thinking that if we are worried about violent crime, the only way to address it is more and more punishment, even though the scientific evidence is precisely the opposite. The way to less violent crime is less poverty, more housing, more health care, more mental health treatment, more drug abuse treatment, etc. Those are the things that the evidence actually shows. There's a beautiful new study that's very rigorous showing that investment in early childhood and elementary school education actually predicts crime decades in the future. These are the kinds of investments that we know that the research demands of us, and it's exactly the opposite of what police are pushing.
It is. It's amazing. It's what we all want, but I guess there's just so much greed that it's not what we're getting. Just too many selfish interests. We're talking to Alec Karakatsanis. You could find him on Twitter at EqualityAlec, ALEC. You go there, then you find his link to his organization, civilrightscorps.org. You can go there right away, make a donation, or check out the organization, especially if you need help. If you're in the spot, man, these guys seem to be doing great work over here. The book, though, that I'm interested in is As Usual Cruelty, the complicity of lawyers in a criminal injustice system. So, Alec, tell us, what are we going to find in this book?
The book is really a description of how the criminal punishment bureaucracy works and an attempt to inspire young people, students, lawyers, non-lawyers, people who are interested in justice, to think about how we might be able to change how the legal system functions. And so the first and I think most important and longest essay in the book is an attempt to show people exactly how the system works from the very beginning. So, for example, using hundreds of examples, it talks about how does our society determine what is a crime and what isn't a crime. So, for example, how did it become the case that it's a crime for poor people to wager in the streets over dice, but it's not a crime for wealthy people to wager over the global supply of wheat or the value of international currencies? So some types of gambling are actually the kind of thing that you make billions of dollars on. You get your name on the wing of a hospital. Other types of gambling make you subject to human caging and the government taking your money and property. How did that happen? How did at different times in this country's history the government decide suddenly to criminalize the possession of certain substances? And oh, by the way, that history shows that it was linked to the government's desire to punish certain ethnic and religious and racial minorities. That's exactly the kind of question, what is a crime, that I try to answer in the book. And then I talk about, given the things that are crimes, how does our society and our legal system decide which of these crimes you're going to enforce and which of these crimes you're going to ignore? And again, I give hundreds of examples. I think most people don't realize, for example, that the United States arrests more people for marijuana possession than for all violent crime combined. How do we get to a society like that? What does it say about the kinds of interests that are actually making decisions about our safety? And then I talk a lot about, I think maybe the most important piece of the book is criticizing progressive and liberal reformers, because I think most of what we're sold as, so-called criminal justice reforms are actually very sophisticated efforts by the people who profit from those systems and benefit from them to preserve the key aspects of that bureaucracy, while convincing well-meaning liberal people that they're doing something about these injustices. So they want to sort of shave off the most grotesque flourishes, but keep the architecture of most of these injustices. And so I try to help people develop a rubric for how you can determine whether some proposed reform is actually a really good thing or really an attempt by the system to preserve its power.
Now, Alec, the minute I heard the expression defund the police, okay, I said, I know that's not going to work, man. Okay, it's not going to work. You know what I mean? But what we do need is to civilianize police, civilianize contact with disputes and stuff like this. What do you make of this whole? Was that like an operation, like a con game, to name it defund the police, to manipulate us?
I think the thing to say about this is social movements often, articulate demands in a way that rubs powerful people the wrong way. I think the demand to defund the police is a very obvious one. Anyone who looks at police fraud, waste, and abuse in their budgets knows that, police budgets are just almost entirely fraudulent. I mean, there is an incredible and just breathtaking array of waste in police budgets. For example, if you look at the budget for Rikers Island in New York, there are several thousand corrections officers right now, as we're talking, on sick leave, much of it fraudulent. The abuse of sick and overtime leave by cops, the incredible expenditures on military weaponry and surveillance and training and junkets, and various sort of corruption-laden contracts. It's just obvious to anyone who's ever spent some time with police budgets. So I think the real problem was with the way that the slogan was sort of used in the media, is that I think it ignores, it made it seem like people who wanted to reduce the size and power of police bureaucracies didn't care about safety. When the defund, what's so important is the other half of the coin, because the people who want to reduce the size and power of police bureaucracies also have a very beautiful vision of what would replace them. We want to spend money instead on nurses, on teachers, on after-school programs, on medical care, on safe places to live and affordable housing, right? On theater, music, poetry, programs for kids after school, on new parks and recreational spaces for young people, which the evidence shows actually reduce crime in neighborhoods significantly. So it's the investments that we need to make in our safety that are really the most important thing. And ironically, police have, for over the last 130 years, ruthlessly surveilled, repressed, infiltrated, and brutalized every major movement for social justice, whether it was women seeking the right to vote, the queer movement, the racial justice movement throughout this country's history, labor organizing. One of the main purposes of the professionalization of police in the northern part of this country in the early 20th century was employers to have organized forms of violence and repression against striking workers. And the same thing in the South. One of the major reasons that police forces banded together and became professionalized was to catch and slave people who had run away. And so that history, only more recently have police build themselves and marketed themselves as interested in public safety. Everyone understood for the first 75 to 100 years of sort of the organized American police force that they were really there to preserve wealth and power of people who own things. And so the defund, I think, it's unfortunately become a very simplistic conversation. But when you understand that what it's really about is investing in other things, then I think it becomes a much more popular message.
Oh yeah, definitely. We definitely need to civilianize all this stuff. Like when you have a problem with your landlord or your neighbor and you're calling up a couple of guys with guns to show up, it's just not the solution. It can only escalate the problem, you know? Now, Alec, when in your personal life, right, you're at a soccer game, your kid's playing soccer, you meet another parent, and they ask, well, what do you do, right? When you try to explain to them how messed up our system is, what kind of reaction do you get?
I think it really depends on who you're talking to. Of course, many, many people, tens of millions of people who have loved ones who have been brutalized by the system, they don't need me to explain anything to them at all. For wealthier people, for predominantly white communities that don't really have to live the violence and surveillance overtly of police in their own lives every single day, and who in fact actually rely on that violence to preserve their own property value, for example, or their own real estate investments. It's a much trickier scenario because a lot of people don't believe you. They have been so heavily propagandized by shows like Law and Order or by the way, you know, the federal government spent enormous amounts of money, we now know, on secret programs to plant storylines and false narratives in major sitcoms and drama shows throughout the 1990s. They did the same thing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s through the CIA, funding programs like the Iowa Writers' Workshop and sort of frontline journalism to create a certain image of what the American government and American legal system look like. And so a lot of the stories we've been told about what the system looks like through the popular press, there's some amazing historical research now being done on all of the work that police departments and the U.S. government over the last half century have done to actually manipulate people's perception of what's going on. And so when you talk to people, they're heavily propagandized. They don't want to believe that there are 500,000 people in jail because they can't pay cash bail. They don't want to believe that the city of Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants per household when Michael Brown was killed. Almost all of the arrest warrants were for unpaid debt. They don't want to believe we have modern debtors' prisons. But when you show them things, people of goodwill and who are well-meaning, when they see the evidence, I think rightly they are quite appalled.
Oh yeah, I did so many shows about Ferguson, what activists were right there on the ground, and it was just insane with those warrants and those tickets and that stuff. There was like one window where you could go pay your ticket. You'd have to go there and knock on the window, and sometimes they wouldn't come to the window. They wouldn't even take your money, just to keep everybody, you know what I mean, to keep everybody on probation, parole, that we're all under some kind of government supervision 24 hours a day. You know, and then you find out, too, that little town there in Texas where these 19 kids just got shot up, 40% of their budget went to police. And we couldn't even get the most basic police protection.
I don't know of a single person who studies these issues seriously who thinks that more police are the way to safer schools. It's just contrary to all of the evidence. This isn't really a conversation about evidence. It reminds me a lot of the climate science denial that companies like Exxon and Chevron engaged in with the help of various political interests over the course of decades. The evidence is very clear that police, prosecutors, and prisons don't make us safer, and our existing levels of investment in them are astronomically higher than every other comparable society. But it's not a conversation about evidence. It's a conversation about mass media and propaganda.
Yeah, and before, too, when you were talking about the propaganda, it makes us think that the police and the criminal justice system is the solution to everything. That same propaganda system, then these young boys, who see this and says, oh, boy, if I become a police officer, I'm going to be a hero. People are going to love me. I'm going to save people. And then when they find out that they're really not liked, once they put on that uniform, that most of the people that are dealing with them do not like them. You could just imagine how that twists their head up and turns them into a violent... Alex, encourage me, man. Alec, encourage me, man. Tell me something good that's going on that we're working on to resolve this situation.
Well, I think the solutions to a lot of these problems are actually fairly easy. We know what they are. They involve people in their own communities organizing, coming together, in solving their problems without state bureaucracy or violence. These are mutual aid groups that are coming together to help people who have addiction or who are unhoused or who are immigrants or refugees, right? These are mutual aid groups that are coming together to support who have experienced sexual assault and trauma and survived other forms of violence. These mutual aid groups all over the country that are popping up are incredibly inspiring because they show the power of what ordinary people can accomplish when they come together. Some of these groups are also coming together to establish bail funds to bail people out of jail in their neighborhoods. They're establishing court-watching groups to monitor what judges and prosecutors or police are doing in court. They're setting up cop-watching groups to actually go out and look at what the cops are doing. So I think that inspires me a great deal. And then also there are really obvious investments that we can make in things like playgrounds, in healthcare access for very, very impoverished families and children that we know actually lead to years and years of less violence in the future. And so, we are making those arguments and winning them in many places around the country. We have to be smarter about how we attack problems like gender-based violence, like violence generally, and we need to be thinking more long-term. And we are having enormous success in conversations all over the country, convincing people to focus on these real, actual root cause solutions. And that always gives me hope. How many people truly get it once they learn about some of the basic information that's been hidden from them?
Okay, don't forget, if you want to follow Alec Karakatsanis, check him out on his Twitter first, Equality Alec, ALEC. And that's where you find all the other links to Civil Rights Corp, civilrightscorp.org. Now, Alec, also, too, we've only got a couple of minutes left. We've got about 3 minutes left. What do you want to tell us about your new Substack column? What's it called? Alec Propaganda?
Yeah, so I have traditionally been doing a lot of threads on Twitter that analyze how the media is manipulating and misleading us to think that cops are really critical, and prisons and prosecutors or punishment in general is really critical to our safety. And so I show time after time after time how the media is getting things wrong. And so finally I was persuaded by a number of people to just start publishing a newsletter that people can sign up for, so they're not subject to the whims of the Twitter algorithm or whatever. So now I have this thing called Alec's Propaganda newsletter, which I launched a week and a half ago or so, almost 2 weeks ago, where I talk about and analyze news articles and the news process in general, and try to give people a really different perspective on the kinds of reporting they see about cops in the media.
And how is that spelled?
Propaganda, Copaganda, and it's Alec's Propaganda newsletter. And you can find it just by searching on Substack for it. And I often link to it on my Twitter, which is @EqualityAlec.
Alec, I got to tell you, man, thank you for your service, man. You're out there doing great work for people. I really appreciate it. People, don't forget, you can find his book, Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System. You can find him on Twitter, Equality, Alec, A-L-E-C, civilrightscorps.org. You can go there and make a donation. This is all stuff. Alex, what do you want to leave us with in the next minute?
Thank you so much for having me and for making space for this incredible and important type of conversation about real safety, and I wish you all the best.
Alec, thank you so much, and it really, really is important. I really encourage people to just at least get the ball rolling. Follow him on Twitter, Equality Alec, and then check out this book, too, as well. Man, a lot of great reviews on Amazon. Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.